Friends and folks, welcome to the Kaiju Lounge, your home for humor, opinions, and nerd shit. My guest tonight is a Hugo Award-winning writer and editor whose work has been seen in Wired, Washington Post, Lifehacker, Kotaku, and so much more. Also, if you're on Blue Sky, his presence is basically CRT porn. His book, Fight Magic Items, The History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs, is available all over the world, both physical and audio forms, guiding you through the evolution and origins of one of the most beloved genres in gaming. Please welcome my guest at this time, Aidan Moher. Adrian, how are you doing? I'm sorry, I said Adrian. Aidan. I knew I was going to mess it up, and I was on a good tear there. I apologize.
No worries.
Aidan, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing really good. How are you doing?
Good. You know, you get on autopilot, and it just becomes, you stop thinking. The brain just turns off. We're gonna hop into everything, but before I do, I have to ask a question that is going to flavor the remainder of this interview. FF6 or FF7?
6.
Good. Okay. Good answer.
7.
Perfect.
I've been like, I've had a roller coaster like relationship with 7 over the course of its life. I'm in a high right now. I quite like 7. But 6 is where my heart is. It was the one that Anyway, we'll get into that, I'm sure. But 6, yeah.
I'm going to say, but I know it's not always, and I think that also speaks to us probably generationally. It's always not always the popular opinion from most, but it is the right opinion.
Yeah, I think maybe it's in my book, but I remember writing something along the lines of show me somebody's favorite Final Fantasy and I'll show you the first one they fell in love with or whatever, first one they played. And I think that's true. 6, introduced the generation of, I'm an elder millennial, I'm 40, and 6 was the one that really broke through to a lot of us. 7 broke through then to a whole other exponentially larger audience. But 6 was the one I think that created a lot of RPG fans back in the mid-90s.
Well, I think 7 also had the advantage of having that free demo disc, right?
Yeah.
And I know that's how a lot of people I knew got into it that otherwise would not have.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we are here talking about RPGs. I'll say as someone who used to be in the wrestling industry, who loves D&D and is a hoarder, I am a fan of Fight Magic and Items separately. But when we combine them together, we get your book. Let's talk a little bit about, I gave a bit at the top there, but tell us a little bit about what is Fight Magic Items.
Yeah, so Fight Magic Items, which came out a couple of years ago, and like you said, is available everywhere, is it's the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. So it takes sort of a personal lens through my experiences as, a kid growing up in the 90s, experiencing and discovering this genre during its golden age, and looks at how it started off as, an homage to Western game design, Western tabletop RPGs, Western computer RPGs like Wizardry and Ultima. And, these young Japanese creators said, we want to make something like that, but we want to make it our own. And that created, some of the biggest, most popular series in the genre, and how that then influenced, the next generation of games and the next generation of creators. And now how we have, games and game creators who are, making some of the best games coming out right now, and they grew up on Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy or Phantasy Star or Dragon Quest. So, that sort of generational, cyclical relationship between Western creators and Japanese creators, the different types of RPG genres.
Great. And now it's, as I understand it, and maybe you can correct me here, but, when, let's go all the way back, right? When D&D came to Japan, typically when we see something going from one country to another, it's really just a direct language change. From what I understand, the actual art and style and layout of the Dungeons & Dragons book is actually more akin to what we later saw in the Capcom beat-em-up games down the line. Do you think, and now I might be even getting this further afield here, do you think it would have captured the imagination of a lot of these Japanese developers had it been more of a, for lack of a better term, straight port with D&D?
I mean, gosh, that's a whole other episode, right? That comes sort of to the heart of the localization versus literal translation conversation that's sort of so popular these days. I think that localization and understanding the core audience and their backgrounds, their interests, their the crossovers of their experiences and cultures and stuff is important. And so I think that something that was catered towards an audience in Japan, that wasn't a straight port of the US or Western guidebooks, player books, was probably good. I'm honestly not too familiar with what they look like in Japan, so now I'm curious to go look at that. But I like one thing that I know about Dragon Quest early on is Yuji Horii, when he was creating it, he specifically went and dipped his toes into Western fantasy tropes, which you and I look at and we see knights in shining armor and dragons and faux medieval settings and say, hey, that's like as generic as it can get. But in the 80s, Yuji Horii looked at that and said, what can I do for Japanese players to make it feel adventurous or far-flung or quote like exotic, for lack of a better word. And he looked at Western fantasy. And so like I think you can sort of see how like especially back in the 80s when that cultural crossover was still happening in its infancy, that like different imagery, different narratives had different impacts on different audiences way back when. So I'm sure it had a big impact on the way that the game was perceived in Japan, for sure.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of an interesting. We always, my dad used to always say, they don't call Chinese food in Japan and in China. And there's always, I think there's a similar thing. Is I think we take for granted how you use the term exotic, right? This sort of Western idea of fantasy, and that Japan has its own mythology and folklore over there. In the same way that, like, I'll throw out as an example of a game kind of from the same area that feels very Japanese, Pocky and Rocky for the Super Nintendo. Is a very Japanese, coded game as far as with the shrines and the yokai and all that kind of stuff. How that feels a little more alien here than it would, where it was released. The 90s, when we talk about this era, was also a very interesting time for RPGs because there's a lot of stuff that didn't get released out here.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is it that you think made these games considered, not marketable for the era to be worth release in the US markets? And why are they kind of getting this resurgence of respect when you look at like a Live Alive remaster or, Seiken Densetsu 3 getting kind of a remake? Why are they getting this sort of reverence back here on a global scale again?
Yeah, I think those are kind of two separate questions in a way. I think that, why were they sort of not seen as big commercial breakout like potential back in the 90s, say? You look at the most popular sort of Japanese RPGs and Japanese RPG, like you kind of bring up like the Chinese food thing, and Kazuma Hashimoto had a great article on Polygon earlier this year about the phrase Japanese RPG and how that can be othering, and it's fabulous, and it's kind of changed the way that I think about and try to use the term Japanese RPG. But that I think kind of comes back into the discussion of what the genre was and where it was in sort of the 90s, and even the most popular ones like Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, like they kind of capped out at 500,000 or 600,000 units, which was a lot, but predominantly those sales were happening in Japan. And it wasn't really until Final Fantasy VII came out, which kind of more overtly featured, especially in its first half, a very Western take on like cyberpunk. And I don't think that it's a surprise that you had sort of a William Gibson Blade Runner-esque opening 10 hours in Final Fantasy VII, and like you said earlier, with a demo disc that really highlighted that helped that genre take off in the West, because over here we do kind of tend towards exceptionalism and main character syndrome in the West, and I think that we like to see ourselves highlighted in the media that we're consuming. And I think that was probably why Final Fantasy VII sort of blew the doors off. Now, you go forward and you look at, like what happened after Final Fantasy VII, and like Xenogears sold over 1 million copies, right? So like when you think about the fact that like Xenogears, a game that like, doesn't have a very strong direct cultural input or footprint, unless you consider like Xenoblade. but like specifically Xenogears couldn't even continue with the rest of its series. It sold almost double what Final Fantasy VI did, right? At the time
Wow.
of release. And
Yeah.
so like you look at sort of the, shifting goalposts of what was like, a hit and what wasn't at that point. And, selling 1 million copies of Xenogears is pretty remarkable back in the 90s. Nowadays, Square is not happy if they don't sell, 15 million copies of something. And then like, the resurgence, I think, kind of goes back to the fact that, when we were growing up in the 90s playing Final Fantasy VI for the first time or whatever, Final Fantasy IV, Phantasy Star, these were all fairly new experiences. We probably all had limited resources, limited money. A lot of them weren't being released. And so now, like that first generation of console RPG players who were 10 when it had its first go around, they're, I'm 40 now and I've got money. And I'm going to buy the Live Alive remake. I'm going to get into Trials of Mana. I'm going to, like, I think that we are just in that same period where like there's commercial potential in capitalizing on our nostalgia. And then I also wrote a piece about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth remake, like that sequel trilogy for IGN earlier this year, where I recognize and point out that I think it's also the fact that a lot of us, not only are we sort of 40 and looking back on our childhood and trying to relive a bit of that or reconnect with that, but we also have kids. And so recognizing that like you can kind of reach a new generation of audiences and get them into Final Fantasy VII by capitalizing on their parents' nostalgia. And I think that that's something that is very powerful. Like we're seeing my kids really into Jurassic Park right now, which is like, I love Jurassic Park when I was the same age she was, right? 10, 9, 10. Like I love Jurassic Park. And I don't think it's a surprise that there's like a really popular Jurassic Park kids show when, the kids of the parents who went to the theater for the original are getting to that same age. And so I think there's a little bit at play there that there's just, opportunity to tap into players who want to revisit their favorites, and also a recognition that maybe like, stuff like Trials of Mana or Live Alive was maybe missed in the West when it shouldn't have been. Those are both fantastic games, right?
Yes.
And for Trials of Mana, they went so far as to like retranslate it for the 3D version and then put out a officially translated version of the original Super Nintendo one featuring the new translation and stuff. Like that's pretty remarkable to me. And it speaks to like, maybe someone at Square Enix saying, hey, we didn't do right by this originally. Let's see what we can do now.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think, even things I would also say, look at things like Octopath Traveler, which is obviously very heavily inspired by that era in both look and gameplay. That they're, to your point, the market is larger because it includes us and all the people who were born after us, right? Where before it was kind of just our generation, I'm the same age. So it was like the same thing. It was just kind of our bubble initially that they had to market to. Yeah. And even then the GamePro ads for like Final Fantasy VI were absolute trash compared to what you actually got in the game.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like, you know what? Like I've been a big video game guy for my whole life, but like when I was in my 20s, that took a backseat till getting my first real job and moving and getting married and my wife being in school and like writing and like I always played video games, but there's a large period of time where I wasn't really able to do that, and then you have kids and your time's limited, and so I think also like life kind of has those natural cycles as well of like sort of media consumption and how that changes, and I do think like it really is about the fact that millennials are kind of reaching this age where we have kids, we have more, not necessarily like more leisure time to ourselves, but when we sit down and we want to play video games and we can do that with our kids, well, like that's a pretty easy transition in terms of like getting the kids then into those same series that we used to love as kids.
Totally. I've got an 18-month-old, and right now the most you can do is chew on the controller, so it's not quite the same yet, but I'm definitely looking forward to getting that stage.
It'll escalate fairly quickly for sure.
Well, let's turn our attention back to the book a bit. There is a heavy history here, right? It is a very long history of these games. How, when you were first deciding to do this book, how do you approach not just where to start, but what to tie in? Like obviously the the Final Fantasies, your Chrono Triggers, Dragon Quest, the big names
Yeah.
makes sense. You
Yeah.
kind of have to. You can't talk about without that. But it's, the genre is so much larger. You bring up Phantasy Star, which I don't think, other than being on the Sega and it not having a lot of options, like doesn't quite hold in the same zeitgeist there, may not be as prominent. Like, how do you decide how to approach this book
Yeah.
and what to add and omit, which I'm
Yeah.
sure was incredibly difficult.
Yeah, that was the biggest challenge of the book, and it's still the one that I look back on and kind of second guess the most. Right, like 2 years later,
Oh,
3 years
sure.
basically since I wrote it. Like I look back and I'm like, oh, I wish I had written about that, or if I only I could predicted that this would happen or whatever. The whole like project started when my agent sent me an email. Before I was actually even his client. So he said we were sort of mutuals on Twitter. We both love JRPGs. He sent me an email and was like, hey man, when are you going to write a JRPG book for me? And I was like, well, I could do that. you want me to do that? So
what an opening line.
Yeah,
business-wise.
exactly.
Beautiful.
And he's fabulous, right? Like, and that sort of relationship helps, because having that type of person who understands the genre and the history and the appeal of these helped just to bounce ideas off. So the original idea for the book that him and I were bouncing back and forth was like an essay collection, essentially. Take the writings that I had written online, published at places like Kotaku or wherever, write, maybe 6 or 7 other pieces that are sort of a flavor with those, put it in a collection and publish that. As I started sort of like assembling that outline, it was like, oh, I should write this, oh, I should write that. And then all of a sudden it's like looking more like a chronological history, right? And so, then I have a big outline and I go, okay, like this essay collection is going to require so much work to like write connective tissue like between these essays. Let's scrap that and just look at what like a chronological essay or history would look like. And so we did that. And of course, I had an outline that had like a million ideas and a million series and a million, chapters that never made it into the book. And so going through that, I wrote out this outline and I had, a big shape that really tried to tackle things really holistically, like series agnostic. And we kind of sold that idea of the book. And then working with my editor, it was like, how are we going to get this into a shape that's like wrangleable, and so like I sold the book as like it was supposed to be 70,000 words. It ended up being 110,000 words, and like the key was I took this outline that I had and I had a sample. I had written the first 15,000 words, first 3 chapters or something, and said, this book is about JRPGs, but like it's the history of Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West, which you could kind of tie directly into Final Fantasy VII success and then Final Fantasy X. And so I said, like, the key narrative, like tying all this together, has to be Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. So I looked through my outline and I found that line. It was either something that was like inspired Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, so like the early parts of the book about Ultima and wizardry and tabletop RPGs, and Hironobu Sakaguchi, who created Final Fantasy, and Yuji Horii, who created Dragon Quest. And then from there, it was like, I went into Phantasy Star because Sega went, hey, we want one of those. They saw Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest doing well. They went, we want one of those. And so that's, where Reiko Kodama comes in and Yuji Naka as a direct competitor. And then, it goes on to like, how did they break into the West? What did that first look like? And then it starts getting in later on to looking at, series that were inspired by Final Fantasy. How does it tie back to Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest? Was it inspired by, or was it, trying to subvert what happened in, in those games? And then, as you get later into the book, past the 16-bit era, it was looking at the boom. Japanese RPGs, console RPGs exploded with Final Fantasy VII. Everything was looking great. And then they sort of faded off once the, PS2 wrapped up, PS3 came in, and so there was another sort of transformational phase of like Final Fantasy was struggling, Dragon Quest was struggling, right? Dragon Quest went forever between between 8 and 11 as like single player mainline RPGs. It was like 15 years. So looking at why that was happening, but then how other RPGs were sort of like looking past Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy to try to figure out how to make something new and taking influences from Western RPGs again, the way that they did in the beginning. And so, it was always looking at how do I tie this back into Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, like what was this story doing something to, recover from the fact that Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were struggling in the West. Like, then that was something that was interesting to kind of tie into. What was the creator of Final Fantasy doing after he left Square and could no longer work on the series he created, stuff like that. So it was really like honing in on like, how does this tie into Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest? And so like then the cutting room floor was
everything's
littered.
A tendril kind of,
yes.
of yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, it all feeds back into that core idea of the history of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And then so like the cutting room floor is littered with finished chapters and outline chapters and all sorts of stuff that I wanted to write about. And I'll read reviews now and they'll be like, why didn't they, like write about this? Or how could you write an RPG book about that? And it was like, well, I wanted to, but my editor was already like mad at me because the book was 40,000 words longer than it was supposed to be. And so fortunately I've had a chance to like write some of those as, features on websites. So I wanted to do a big section on like game localization, and I was able to write that for Washington Post. And I spoke to, Alex O. Smith, who translated Vagrant Story and Xenogears and worked on a bunch of stuff. Richard Honeywood, who worked on Xenogears. Did Alex work on Xenogears? He came in on Final Fantasy VIII. But in any case, I talked to all of those guys and looked at what localization was like in the 90s. So, the Sega Saturn was another one. I wanted to do a big chapter on the Sega Saturn because it's a fascinating console RPG in Japan, right? Like, whereas in the States, the story is completely different. And so I couldn't justify putting that in there because it didn't really have influence in the West the way it did. But I was eventually able to write that for Unwinnable and look at this, the story of Japanese RPGs on the Sega Saturn and how it thrived in Japan. So, those stories kind of came out over time, and I'm happy that they're out there now.
That's great. Was there anything in either prepping or the process of writing this book that surprised you? I mean, you've been a fan for a while, but were there tidbits of information that definitely kind of took you aback?
Phantasy Star. I was a Nintendo kid, so I didn't really have experience with Phantasy Star outside of, I'd played the first few hours of a few of them and it was like, aware of their ethos and what they were. But as soon as I started researching the series, specifically like researching Reiko Kodama, Aoki, and some of the creators, I was like, oh, this has to be more. Like, there needs to be more of this in the book, because those creators and that story were so fascinating to me. And I've walked away with such a like newfound and immense respect for creators like Reiko Kodama and what she was able to do with a team that was like relatively new, relatively green, sort of created reactively to the success of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest and created something that was so wholly unique and so ahead of its time in the way that it wanted to center, the stories of like women in these environments and, featured a transgender or a intersex character in the 80s, and the way that it wanted to be more and look outside, like the typical storylines and character archetypes that we were exploring in the games at the time. And it just, I had no idea about any of that, really, not from a historical perspective. And so that was the big one for me. I just like walked away with so much like respect for what those people were doing at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It does, especially when you think of at Sega being the competitor system, to Nintendo, to the only two players for a very long time throughout our lives. It's amazing that, it's been mined for like an MMO and they brought it back in forms, but to not, kind of touch back to its history when Sega's been mining its history for a lot of other things as of late.
And they're like,
we can only dream.
They're a big RPG company now too, right? Like with like the work that they do with Atlas. Like, it wasn't, with Phantasy Star and sort of the 80s and the early 90s, like you could look at Sega as like an RPG console, but then like, and the Saturn was big, but not really from Sega specifically by the time the Dreamcast hit. And then like once they left the console business, like you didn't really associate that genre with them. And now they're one of the like biggest, like Yakuza and Metaphor and Persona, like all of those things kind of tying back into Sega is pretty remarkable to me.
That's a good point.
And then like
Are
just
there?
to like quickly go back, there were also like a couple
Yeah.
of interesting like factoids that I dug up while researching the book that stood out to me that I always like to share. And like the big one for me, we were talking about Final Fantasy VI earlier. The big one for me is that the composer Uematsu wrote all the character themes, which are like so iconic. He wrote them all in
Amazing.
a vacuum by like on their own, and then looked to the game and was like, I'm gonna give this one to Locke, I'm gonna give this one to Shadow, I'm gonna like, which is just like incredible to me, because like if you think about the fact that like Shadow is so like defined by that spaghetti western like guitar twang,
Yeah.
right, and like how different that would have been applied to Locke, right? And it would have worked for Locke. Like it made him more of like a, you know, like a spaghetti western style adventurer, and the fact that Uematsu could create these character themes and then after the fact go in there and apply them to characters, and they all fit perfectly. Like
Yeah.
I could never imagine
That's wild.
a world where those character themes didn't fit those characters. So that was one of my favorite little factoids there. And you know, the fact that Final Fantasy VI again was like made in less than a year, and it's just like bananas to me, right? But yeah, lots of little things like that that I discovered along the way that just blow my mind compared to especially what modern game design is like.
Yeah, that's crazy. 'Cause, yeah, it's so essential to the feel of each scene and everything like that. And like, another example being Cyan with the
Yeah.
very sort of Native American kind of inspired sort of drum beat attached to
Mm-hmm.
his. It's really weird to think that that even could have been done
Yeah.
in a vacuum.
Yeah. But it also spoke to like how much like, you know, individual creators were sort of allowed to just explore and be creative, and like weren't constrained necessarily back then by a lot of the financial, you know, incentives and goals that exist now in game development. And they were also young, like, you know, researching the book again, like Chrono Trigger is a favorite of mine, and I love the soundtrack. I love the soundtrack to Chrono Cross, and like Yasunori Mitsuda was like 21 when he wrote the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. Like I
Oh,
could barely
geez.
get
Okay.
myself, like I could barely get out of bed or like, you know, feed myself when I was 21. And here he was making some of the best soundtracks of all time. Like remarkable stuff.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Insane.
And because all of
Um,
these people were so young at the time, they're still alive and making games. And that's like a really unique perspective to be able to tap into when you're writing a history of something like RPGs.
That's true, because you're not just following the games or the genre or even the series itself. You are following the people
People. Yeah.
behind them. You're
And that's what,
following, you know,
yeah.
their evolution too.
Yeah. I've always wanted to, like, whenever I approach writing about games, I always want to write about people. You know, I say I write about video games and the people who make them and play them. Right. Because those are the stories that are most interesting. Find people, not games. And so as you read Fight Magic Items, you read my other stuff, you're going to find there's a lot of focus on who these people were, why they were doing the things that they were doing, how they were doing the things that they were doing, and you know, just digging into like what makes people interested in making games and playing games.
Yep. You can't talk about an art form without talking about the human element to that art
Yeah.
form. And I think that applies across the board. Um, you mentioned, Square Enix is kind of held to a different standard now.
Yeah.
It's you can already tell it's a loaded question. I would love to get your thoughts and opinions on kind of where they are now, and I want to say specifically in the veins of how they handle Final Fantasy, because it's
Yeah.
obviously a big franchise for them.
Yeah.
It's also obvious that there is both a reverence for its history and
Yeah.
an avoidance of its history. You look
Yeah.
at the gameplay of more recent ones and how they've really kind of pushed away from what brought them to the dance, so to speak, as well
Yeah.
as an assistance on mobile and, various other kind of, I don't want to say shovelware. I don't want to put down necessarily some of the other Final Fantasy offshoots that have been out there, but
Yeah.
it's hit or miss.
Yeah, it's hit or miss. I mean, like to me, the most interesting things Square Enix continues to do are some of their lower tier, lower budget games like Diofio Chronicle and the Live Alive remake. Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D remake just came out, and it like smashed
Right.
the like user count for Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 15 on Steam. right? Like it almost doubled up on
Wow.
the highest like peak user count. And so I look at that kind of stuff and I say like, you know, you have to consider that this was a day and date release on PC, not like a later port like some of the bigger games. But I do think that like one of the things that really defined Square early on was experimentation, was risk taking, and just agility. They were making games quickly. They were giving people, you know, just that flexibility to explore new space. Like Xenogears was, what a remarkable game to go from like Final
Oh
Fantasy
yeah.
IV to Xenogears in the span of whatever that was, like, you know, 5 years or something like that. Now you can't even make a Final Fantasy game in 5 years, let alone go from Final Fantasy IV to Xenogears. And so
Right.
I feel like, you know, Square with the mainline Final Fantasy games. I wasn't a big Final Fantasy 16 fan. I liked some of the ideas that it was playing with, but I felt like it was sort of like you're saying, it was sort of chasing an audience. It felt like it could retain its existing audience and add to that by making changes. And I just don't think that that necessarily worked the way that they wanted to. I feel like, you know, they wanted to go for this character action game, but I don't know if they either felt like they had to simplify it because the series has a predominantly like, you know, turn-based player base, or you know, if they just didn't quite get there. But you know, by the end of the game I found it very repetitive in terms of like just using the same like cooldown cycle over and over again. And that just
Yeah.
was never really what Final Fantasy was about. It was always about experimentation. It was always about, you know, like encouraging the player to like, you know, create their own experiences through the materia system or through Final Fantasy VI's large you know, group of player characters that they could add to their party. Final Fantasy V's job system, tactics job system, 12's job system, all of those were so experimental and saying like play the game the way that you want to play the game and approach this. And I think that that agility is sort of getting lost. Like they got so wrapped up with 15 taking as long as it did, that,
Yeah.
you know, I think that really created a stumbling block. And 16 being such a departure is like I'm okay with them taking risks, but at, you know, ultimately at what expense do those risks come? Like I don't, I think looking at Final Fantasy and thinking like, oh, this is going to be a Call of Duty where we're just going to like create these incredibly unreasonable like sales expectations, um it's just not the way that series needs to be. It's not what its history is. It's not, you know, like Final
Yeah.
Fantasy 7 didn't sell 10 million units and like launch the genre in the West because it was like focus tested to appeal to a new audience. It was very specifically like made for Japanese players. Like that's what
Right.
Sakaguchi was looking to as his audience. Um, and I think that, you know, you need to look at that and say like, let's let creators make like really refined experiences based on what they want to see, and that kind of stuff is gonna, you know, hopefully hit. And I mean, then there's a whole other conversation about like the, you know, the sustainability of AAA game development and whether that's even possible going forward, right? Like I just don't know that you can make games the size of Final Fantasy in a way that like provides agility that can also sustain the ridiculous budgets and team sizes and stuff that go into making games these days. And so like I hope that Square Enix, you know, I see like Final Fantasy 16 missing its sales targets and then Square doubling down and saying, oh, like, you know, we're going to address this by making more big AAA games and focus on quality over quantity. And it's like, well, that's not like the same thing. Like quality is not like the biggest shiniest graphics like Final Fantasy
Right.
16. It's also like really careful, refined, you know, like experiences like Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D remake, right? Like those are both high quality experiences. Bravely Default 2 was a high quality experience. Harvest Stella was a high quality experience. It's not AAA like blockbuster style games, but that doesn't need to always be like the be all and end all. Like to me, the most
Right.
exciting stuff in games right now is happening in the indie space. And they have minuscule budgets compared to
Yes.
Square Enix. And so
Absolutely.
look at stuff like Sea of Stars. Like it had a big budget for an indie game, millions of dollars, but that's a fraction of what Final Fantasy 6 cost. And like which one has stuck with me
Right.
more at this point, right? Sea of Stars. Now like Sea of Stars could have used, you know, a bit of like polish in areas that you might get, and Square Enix might be able to kind of, you know, apply to a game like that. But like, I think you could look at something like Sea of Stars and Octopath Traveler 2 from Square Enix, and I don't think you look at those and say the quality is low just because they're smaller or
No.
like more focused game experiences that are intended to sell 1 million units and be profitable, instead of having to sell 15 million units and still be declared, you know, not a success. Like, that's just insane to me. And so, like, you know, then we get into the conversation of whether, you know, like, game making is compatible at all with quarterly financial results and shareholder returns. And I think the answer is no. But, you know, games are expensive to make. You need to have money to make them. And how do you do that? Like, where's that middle ground between getting financial investors who are going to give you all the money you need to make a big experience versus like indies who are, you know, fighting and scraping for every penny they can to get their game out the door?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been something to be said for the fact that, you know, the games industry at that top level is probably, you know, shooting beyond its reach. The point is the
Yeah.
technology is not
Yeah.
there to do all the
Yeah.
things they're trying to advertise for
And
us.
like,
And if we could just be a generation back now,
yeah.
maybe things would be
Yeah.
a little bit better.
And like, sometimes technology is like not only not the answer, but like also part of the problem. Like, when I was writing the
Mhm.
book, so many of the old interviews, like, I went back and referenced, one of the things I really wanted to do was reference interviews with the creators at the time of the game's release rather than like retrospectives. I read a lot of interviews with creators like in the 80s and 90s. And one of the things they talk about is creative constraints and how the constrained technology required them to come up with creative solutions and to tackle things within sort of that defined closed environment to create a really great experience with those boundaries. And now we've reached a point where games can be anything and can be, as, you know, what is Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth is like 160 gigs or something, right? Which is
Huge,
just
yeah.
insane, right? And your game engines can do pretty much everything, and that lack of creative constraint is really hard for people creating, you know, new experiences, because there's always opportunity for scope creep. And so
Right.
reading the, you know, those interviews and looking at these older games and seeing the creators being like, oh, you know, like, it's, you know, we have these constraints on this console, like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, where how can we make a computer style RPG for a console where we have no memory, we have very low compute power, we want it to be played on a controller on a TV? How do we create a great experience out of that? We can't just port wizardry. What do we do that, you know, that looks at the environment that these players are going to be playing in and make something great out of that? And, you know, we're at a point where technology is so big, and you have, like you say, people at the top who are like, well, you can do everything, so just do everything. You know, I just read Jason Schreier's new book, Play Nice, which is about the rise and fall of
Yes.
Blizzard. And he
Very
it's
good.
fabulous. And he kind of looks at the fact that, like, early Blizzard was defined by a lot of the things we've been talking about, which is, you know, like, small groups of passionate, really talented people coming together and taking risks and creating new things. And then one of those things they created was World of Warcraft, and it started bringing in insane amounts of money. And so then you had people like Bobby Kotick at the top being like, why are you making this when you could be making another World of Warcraft? Why are you going to make this when it's only going to make us $250 million when you could make World of Warcraft 2 and it's going to make us $1 billion? And it's like, well, because making $250 million is still an absurd, like, profit margin, and that's okay. But the chasing the money then sets the, you know, like, the requirements for what these games that are supposed to be sort of creative, like, mutual experiences between the creator and the player should be defining what the game needs to be, not, you know, profit returns for shareholders.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, Bobby Kotick can rot in hell. So looking, I mean, I think one of the things that I also find interesting is the, you know, how well we're talking about, you know, where Square Enix has been, how well that, like, the Final Fantasy VII remakes have
Yeah.
been taken on, right? You know, I think Final Fantasy 16, supposed to be one of their biggest games,
Yeah.
kind of came and went. And
Yeah.
now we're not, you know, we're barely talking about it other than just kind of, you know, the problems with Square Enix.
Yeah.
7, you know, they're obviously going to keep, you know, cutting this up and releasing them as, like, these parts to the point where who knows what the games will ever get.
Yeah.
But they are merging kind of a little bit of what you're talking about is that new sensibility for,
Mhm.
scope and that epic feel, but they've been able to successfully combine it with the magic of the past. And I think both from gameplay perspective, having kind of a modern combat and a, turn-based combat in there,
Yeah.
but also the one thing I think Square Enix always did well in the past, which is the general Final Fantasy vibe, right? It's something that I think has been lost in the last couple of entries, because there is a feel, even if each Final Fantasy game is a different world, a different story, there is kind of a similar vibe to how those games kind of make us feel when we play them. And I think the more recent games have been able to capture that. Do you think the Final Fantasy VII remakes would do as well as they are doing right now if they weren't based on a pre-existing story?
Like financially or like fan reaction? Because I think those are two
I
different things.
I think that's actually a very valid point.
Yeah.
Let's go with fan reaction. I
Yeah.
think, I because to in the end, as a consumer, I care more about how much I'm enjoying
Yeah.
the game than I do
Absolutely.
about,
As we should.
how much the
Yeah.
game made, right? As we
Yeah.
should, but also is not the reality of capitalism.
No. No, it's not. I think that the story and the fact that it's a remake and it's like a remake slash pseudo sequel is a huge part of the appeal. It drives a lot of the narrative. I think that's important to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and remake success. Um, but I also think just the underlying systems are a great modernization of exactly what you're talking about, like what felt like Final Fantasy in the past, right? The way that it merges a turn-based sort of menu-based combat with real-time combat is just really clever, really remarkable. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that like playing it after playing Final Fantasy 16 sandwiched in between remake and rebirth, like rebirth, especially in the way that it sort of like improves the combat experience, just really nails, I think, what they wanted from Final Fantasy 16 was something that looks visually more, engaging for people, especially for clips online, right? They want stuff that's going to look good when it's shared online and posted
Which
online,
is a
YouTube
big part of, I think, every game
streams and stuff like
company's kind of
that.
marketing strategy.
Exactly. And so Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth does that incredibly well while also maintaining sort of that idea that every piece of combat is a puzzle in a way, that you're utilizing tools at your expense. Like Final Fantasy 16 just came down to, like I was saying earlier, I just had my one rotation, I had 3 moves, and I would just, it was like an MMO rotation, which makes sense given the team's background. But I always felt like Final Fantasy 16 wanted each of the icons to give Clive a new move set and like change the way he moved about the battlefield. So you have Titan. You don't just get Titan's moves on cooldown, but you have a big hammer. You're slow and you're plotting. Your damage reduction's really high. You have Garuda and you have the claws, and that impacts how you play the game in the moment to moment combat. And I think that something like that is really emblematic in the way that Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth gives you access to multiple characters in your party, and playing Tifa and playing Barrett and playing Cloud is very different. They serve different roles in combat.
Yeah.
The way they move about the battlefield is different. The way they attack and the way they use range or close combat is different. And so you're switching it up in the same way that, the other games were allowing you to have that level of, like imprinting on your party and the way that you built your party in earlier games. Whereas Final Fantasy 16, like having one controllable character, just felt like, a character action game, but it didn't have the depth of like the best character action games. They brought on the Devil May Cry guy, which was great, and the feel of the combat was good, but it was like at a point you're like, oh, this is actually just like really like rote like combat where there's basically one solution to every battle. And that just like wasn't fun. And so like if I look at something like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as a template for like a unique experience going forward, if they were to take that, make Final Fantasy 17 like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but with a new world, new story, I think that could be really big. And I think it would have more of like what you were talking about earlier, far more of a long tail because it gives you a world that you want to spend time in, right? Like
Right.
so much was said about all the mini games in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but like because of the quest based structure, because of like a world where you feel like you're actually exploring, I think it just has a long tail where people want to return to the game a little bit more than what happened with 16. So I think, yeah,
That's fair.
I think it could create a foundation for a really great game going forward. And maybe it's Final Fantasy. It's going to look different than Rebirth, right? But taking that foundation, like I think the Rebirth battle system should just be the battle system for Final Fantasy going forward. Take what 15 did, it just totally evolves into something like very coherent, very fun to use. Take that battle system the same way active time battle was the battle system in multiple Final Fantasies from whatever 4 till 10 or 4 till 9. Take this one, take Rebirth's battle system, and then build great experiences around it. What was it,
They do,
Nintendo?
because it's the second time in a year that they've been nominated for I think this game has been this series has been nominated for awards specifically in the Final Fantasy VII, not necessarily just the Final Fantasy genre. Like people love it, people want more of it. Hopefully that says something.
I don't know what sales look like. I think Rebirth sales were a little soft compared to Remake. So I'm curious because and that could be a double-edged sword, right? It could say like, oh, people aren't interested in this, but it also maybe shows that in the book world, because my background's like as a book critic and a writer, in the book world, like second books in the series and third books, there's always diminishing returns, right? And so in some ways, like to answer your question, like in some ways the trilogy setup of Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth is probably sort of like a bit of a poison pill for sales going forward, because people aren't going to buy Rebirth if they feel like they had to play Remake first and then whatever Reunion or whatever they're going to call the third one is going to have that same problem. And so in a way, I think that template could almost find more mainstream success going forward as it's been refined through these 3 titles. Take it into Final Fantasy 17 and you almost have a recipe for creating something that feels really, really like hyper polished from a systems perspective, and provides that new narrative experience with the big flashy visuals, with the the stuff that looks great for YouTube and Twitch streamers, looks great when it's clipped and posted to social media. That's all baked in at this point. That's solved with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So then, Nintendo talks a lot about how they come up with their systems and their gameplay first. They nail great gameplay, and then they build a world and a story around it. Do the same thing here. Like Rebirth is amazing. It's gameplay. Take that, build an amazing narrative experience around it. Take Final Fantasy 16 and write a story that doesn't sideline all the women and just turn them into sort of victims of kidnapping and sexual assaults until they just kind of get shoved into the background. Take that idea, what you learned from what Final Fantasy 16 did wrong. It had a beautiful world. The graphics were gorgeous. Just kind of combine what worked about both titles and make Final Fantasy 17 not like something that's trying to be something for everybody, but something that's trying to be what it needs to be on its own.
Avoid the lowest common denominator syndrome that a lot of the series that are released every year that we usually lambast kind of run into.
I think one of the first Final Fantasies that really had a negative reception was 13, right? 12 was sort of divisive, but it also had a lot of people who really loved 12. 13 was fairly, even at the time, panned for what it was. We go back to one of your earlier questions. What was something that surprised me when I was researching for the book? One of the things that surprised me was that Final Fantasy 13 cites as a major influence, or as an influence on the series, Call of Duty as an influence on what they wanted to do with Final Fantasy 13, which is just kind of insane, right? And you look at that and you see Western influences have always played a big role in the series. But, when you're starting to look at Call of Duty and you have somebody higher up who's like, hey, Call of Duty sells so many units. How do we incorporate, how do we get into that audience? And you're having people say Call of Duty was an influence on Final Fantasy 13. And it's well, come on, guys. I've got this sort of running theory that in the AAA space, every game is becoming the same game. The new Dragon Age is God of War, which itself sort of was looking towards some combination of Japanese RPGs and Western RPGs and God of War action games. Like, it's all kind of combining into this one game, right? You have a skill tree, you have experience points, you have like combat arenas. They're all becoming the same thing. And I think Final Fantasy needs to go the opposite direction, right? It needs to know what a good Final Fantasy is, not what a good AAA, like generic focus group game is. Because that's going to have, it might have a higher floor of sales, but it's also going to, I think, have a lower ceiling on sales. And we're seeing that with 16, right? Like, its sales didn't meet expectations. Now, Square Enix expectations are always way too high. Like, whoever makes them up is like, I think, trying to appeal to shareholders early on, and then they miss them every time. So, is it realistic that they thought 16 was going to sell as much as they did? Like, probably not. It still sold a lot of copies, but I think it was also held back by the fact that it was neither this nor that. It was trying to be something for like everybody.
Yeah. God, no, that's absolutely fair. We're getting towards the end of things, and I've got, far more questions than we have time to get to. But where do you see the state of the RPG sort of going? Both, you kind of mentioned the indie space a little bit, and how, and I think the state of gaming in general, there's a lot more reverence for our past that are being recreated in the indie space, but also at the AAA level, we are speculating how great it would be for them to adopt a certain system. I'm not holding hopes, but as someone who's now looked at the history, and often history repeats itself, where do you see kind of things moving?
Yeah, I'm actually really like positive about the outlook for the RPG genre at this point. And again, like I kind of see the AAA space going towards like, every game feeling like Horizon or whatever, or God of War. But I think the indie space is really interesting. I think there's been some fantastic indie RPGs that have come out. Stuff like I mentioned Sea of Stars earlier, but Chained Echoes was awesome.
That was a good game.
Quartet is coming up, which I'm really excited about. And then there's sort of like, one's sort of on the back burner. What is it called? There was that Kickstarter, and it was like for 2 RPGs, one that was like Shadow Hearts inspired, and one was Wild Arms inspired. It's been so long at this point that I can't remember the names, but like, I like the fact that we have creators not like regurgitating the past. I think we always need to be carving space forward, but also no longer like rejecting the past. Like, I think the RPG genre through the PS3, Xbox 360, like, it just wanted to like reject the past. It was like, nobody likes turn-based anymore. Like, players don't like turn-based. Well, like, there's been so many examples of that just not being correct at all. Persona sells a bajillion copies. Metaphor has sold a ton of copies, right? Like I said, Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D is doing great right now. And so like, the fact that we're looking back and saying, oh no, this genre didn't get like, it wasn't, turn-based wasn't a limitation. Pixel art isn't a limitation. It's an expression of gameplay design, right? And visual design, and it's just as valid as anything else. And you have, so many indie creators that are making these great RPG experiences, and you have lots of, like, you still have Square making stuff like Dragon Quest or Live Alive, and I hope they keep doing that, right? I hope they don't give up on that, because those are some of the games and the experiences that I've enjoyed the most, right? Like, I'm so happy to see, for instance, Sakaguchi's Fantasian coming to consoles, right? Because it's been locked on phones, and it's very much the idea of like, hey, what if like the PlayStation era of Final Fantasies just never went away, right? And it uses like pre-rendered backgrounds, these beautiful like hand-built pre-rendered backgrounds, not pre-rendered, they're photographed, like they're like little mini sets.
They're gorgeous.
But the idea, like, pre-rendered in terms of like gameplay experience, right? Where you're moving around a static scene that's like but like then implemented with like, or a lot of like quality of life, modern quality of life stuff that's been implemented to make the experience feel better in 2024, 2025. And so I hope we continue to see stuff like that says, oh, these experiences from the 90s and the early 2000s, like, they're still good. They're not, we don't need to forget them. They weren't building blocks towards something, quote unquote better. They were great experiences as they were, and they can coexist with stuff like Dragon Age. They can coexist with other, other bigger, more action focused or AAA style or like hybrid RPGs. So, I hope that we get it all. And I just hope that companies like Square Enix don't get their eyes set on the idea that like they should focus on games that'll sell 10 plus million, that there's still a lot of value in a game that sells 1 million copies to an audience that's not ever going to grow above 1 million, but you know, you make your profit. It should be enough for shareholders. It's not really anymore, but we can't control that aspect. We can't control sort of where late stage capitalism is going.
Well, if they are one of my 5-ish viewers, then hopefully they are paying attention, and
Yes.
we'll take that to heart.
Yeah.
I want to throw in one more question. I'm a realist. Yeah. I want to throw in one more question before I let you go. Here is, you know, you've been a relative JRPG historian here. What game or games out there do not get the love or attention that they deserve in the genre?
Oh man.
Which is probably a lot, but
yeah, I know. It's like, yeah, how to kind of whittle them down. I think that Square, like sticking with Square, I think that they have a lot of like really interesting, like late generation Super Nintendo RPGs that have great fan translations that a lot of people don't know about. So we're like talking about stuff like Treasure Hunter G or Treasure of the Rudress, which are really interesting. Right. I really like those games. And then like, you know, and they're available, you know, you can play them on emulators, you can get them anywhere. But then I think also just like there are some great indie RPGs that I think are worth tracking down. There's one that recently came out called Terra Memoria. I wrote about it on my newsletter, and it's this like cozy RPG that has like Breath of Fire 4 inspired visuals. It's like really warm and cozy and kind. It's like It's like 12 hours long. It has beautiful music, beautiful graphics. And like, does the combat get a little, you know, rote by the 8th hour? Like it does. I solved combat pretty early and would just do the same things, but it's just so likable and like not something you would see from a big audience or a big studio. And it was just fun to play. You know, I just enjoyed the 12 or 13 hours I spent with it, and I still think about it, right? Whereas like some other bigger games come and go, and I play them and that's fine, and then I kind of forget about them. But like, you know, just looking at what indie game makers are making, and then like there's like a resurgence of people making Game Boy RPGs like that play on original hardware. Yes. And that stuff exists that people just don't know about, right? And they're pretty cool. They're pretty great. They take like, you know, the idea of what a Game Boy RPG looked like, and now like, but building it through like modern game design methodologies and ideas, and you know, they're beautiful and they exist, and so many people just don't know about them. And I've been trying to pitch an article about the community of people who make like modern Game Boy games. It hasn't found a home yet, but like I wish it would, because I want the mainstream gaming sites to write about this stuff, right? Like we don't just have to cover the big releases. Let's look at what community game makers are making going forward. So that, you know, that kind of stuff, like looking around the edges of things, older games that maybe never really came out in the West, or you know what people are doing that isn't being covered on, you know, the front page of Polygon or whatever at this point.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's so many people doing great stuff, yeah. And I think, you know, obviously the AAA stuff, even the big name indie stuff gets clicks, but it doesn't mean we should ignore what a great community that gaming has.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're also seeing like, you know, sort of popular game series being revived nowadays with remakes like Lunar and Suikoden coming out, like which are two of my absolute favorite series that like a lot of people just weren't around for at the time, or like Lunar and Suikoden have been so expensive like since the day they were released, basically, that like just, you know, more people being able to get their hands on these series and games that were popular at the time, so they're not necessarily overlooked, but they were inaccessible. Super Mario RPG being another one, right? So I'm happy to see like Lunar and Suikoden getting another chance. You know, and then you have the spiritual successor stuff like Aidan Chronicle, which I really liked, which was made by the people who created Suikoden and stuff. So, you know, like it's just, I think there's just a lot out there that deserves attention that, is never going to sell 1 million copies, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth the time going into it. I think we all get caught up on the idea of playing like the major new release, right? Like I feel as somebody who writes about games, like, you know, if Metaphor is out, I wasn't planning on getting Metaphor, and then some people said it was good, and I was like, oh gosh, I gotta play Metaphor, I gotta, you know, cover it, I gotta have opinions, and like that's me as a games writer, games journalist. But like I think everybody feels that way, right? Social media tricks us into feeling like we have to be playing the latest releases. But you don't have to. Go back and buy Harvestella. Like it's a Final Fantasy farming sim that is awesome.
Right.
And it came out a few years ago and people don't remember it, but it's amazing. And it's by Square, you know, and it gives that feel of like PS2 style RPGs. And it's like, that's great. Go buy that. You know, you don't have to be playing.
Jump in the backlog a little bit. You know, you bought exactly. Steam games you don't need.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And don't feel so like, maybe that's my answer. Like, don't feel like you have to be caught up with like all the new releases all the time. Like, you know, spend some time with those older games that, you know, you were excited to buy, or you were excited when they came out and never played. And now's the time. Right now I'm about to play Vagrant Story, you know, like go back and spend all this time on Vagrant Story and stuff. You know, I've been playing Panzer Dragoon Saga, which is new to me, and it's like, you know, it's just as valuable as being able to go online and talk about Metaphor, you know, or talk about whatever Dragon Quest. Go back and like find the stuff that is interesting that people aren't talking about.
And it's good for art and creativity, because I just had, you know, a very good friend of mine who's, by the time we air this, his book will be released. Kalina the Cutthroat, Elijah Conspector, one of my close friends, loved Suikoden and talked about how his fantasy novel, there's a lot of inspiration he pulled from Suikoden 2. It's a lot of untapped potential.
Yes.
I'd have a lot of questions on that if we had more time, but we've already hit the hour, and I know you got a day to get back to. So before we go, where can people find you, Aidan?
Sure. I'm on Blue Sky at aidanis.fun. I also have a newsletter called Astrolabe. You can find that at astrolabe.aidanmoher.com. I'm sure that'll all be in the show notes. Those are sort of the two predominant places. But I'm also, you know, a freelance games journalist, so I have pieces popping up all over the place now and then. So you can just kind of keep an eye out for that. Almost always covering Japanese RPGs or retro gaming, or sort of the communities intersecting those two interests.
Fantastic.
Oh, and I have a book.
Again.
You can find me in bookstores.
Oh, yes, of course.
Fight Magic Items. It should be in any bookstore. And if it isn't in your local bookstore, I do encourage you to try to buy from local bookstores. If they don't have it, they can order it from the publisher, and it should come in no time for you. So go check out your local bookstore.
Great. And look, if any part of this conversation, even a sliver of it, was interesting to you, then it's just a tip of the iceberg of what is in the book. Please go check it out. We'll provide links to everything also below. Aidan, thank you so much for popping on. For everyone else, please, the usual spiel, like and subscribe, because algorithms and shit like that. You can find me at Boss Monster Kaiju just about everywhere. Until next time, stay cool, stay hip, stay heavy. Good night.